People often extrapolate what we talk about here at Nomad Capitalist, going where you're treated best, finding better places for your money, to other parts of their financial plan. And for Americans, the idea of looking at qualified retirement accounts like IRAs often comes up once people realize there may be better places to put their money. So today, I'm going to share with you 3 things you can do with your IRA or your retirement account once you realize there may be better options. Hi, I'm Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist, where our team of nearly 50 people, our network of global experts around the world, help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. Now, let's talk about retirement accounts, especially for Americans. Growing up in the United States, I learned about how the financial system worked. I learned about retirement accounts, and I remember exactly where I was when I was 22, 23 years old. I've always been an entrepreneur as an adult for the most part, and I got a call from my domestic tax advisor. I'm driving down the street, and he said, hey, you're starting to do pretty well, and why don't we get every tax deduction that we can? Why don't you throw some money in a retirement account? We'll save you a couple bucks, and why not, basically. And growing up around financial education, I remember thinking to myself, but I value control of my money. I don't want to put my money into basically a dark hole where I can't touch it for, the time would have been 36, 37 more years without paying a penalty. And on top of that, yes, you're getting the tax deduction now, but if you're doing okay, if you do a halfway decent job investing, basically that money's going to compound. And when you take it out, you're going to then pay taxes. And so it's like, wouldn't you rather, there's the Roth IRA, wouldn't you rather just pay the tax now and get the tax-free growth? Obviously, there are different options, but a lot of people, get into the IRA trap. And so, what do you do with your money once it's already in an IRA? If you are not 22 years old, but you've been saving into an IRA for some time, what do you do with that money? Or if you've had a job in the United States and you have some kind of 401k or 403b and you leave the job because you're going to go overseas, for instance, and you can roll it over, what do you do with that money? It's in the system. You can't take it out. You have to pay a penalty, and you may have to pay taxes if you take it out. What do? Here's the concern that I've always had with the system is when you don't have control, the other party can always change the rules, and the government's probably the worst at that, right? Because the idea is in an IRA, you put it in now, you take the tax deduction while you're making good money, and then when you're old, you'll take it out at a lower tax rate because tax rates are lower for retirees, which of course with the talk of rising tax rates is nonsense to begin with. We've all known since I was, yay high, that the U.S. government is broke. They're going to only rack up bigger and bigger debt. They're going to have to raise taxes. They're going to have to do all kinds of crazy things to get their money back. Of course, your taxes are going to be higher later. And by the way, whose goal is it to retire with less money than they made when they were working? Shouldn't it be your goal to retire with more money through proper investing and through saving and being a good financial steward of your money? And so it never worked for me. Now, if you're in the system, what do? There's 3 things. Now, my disclaimer here is I'm not a financial advisor. This is not financial advice. You know the deal. But if I'm looking at this situation with my own money, a couple things I can do in the context of a nomad capitalist. Number 1, I can take that IRA and I can move it offshore. So if you have a couple different IRAs or one different IRA, that's fine. You can take that and you can offshore it, generally through an offshore IRA corporate structure, LLC, what have you. Now, the jurisdictions that we would use for these structures are often different than the ones that we would use for an active structure. So jurisdictions that I might tell you to avoid could be good for this kind of structure because for a more passive structure, you might find more banks, brokerages, that kind of thing willing to work with you than they would be working with an active business incorporated in the same jurisdiction. So there is some paperwork to handle this. You need to basically form the company, move it out of the, sell the stuff, move it into the structure, move it offshore, whether it's foreign bank accounts, foreign brokerages. You open up a lot more potential for where you can invest. And so obviously IRAs have some constraints. Offshore IRAs are a lot more open. So potentially there are investments that you could do that are much more profitable, as well as you can put it overseas to where you have some level of just feeling more comfortable that your money isn't sitting in the US. Or if you have gold in a vault, in IRAs, for example, there's more restrictions on that. Maybe you want to put it somewhere else overseas, okay? So there's going to be some paperwork with this. There's going to be a couple ongoing costs. Generally what I say is you want to be in the low 6 figures to do this. I know that there are guys out there selling this to everyone with a $26,000 IRA. It just doesn't make sense. Again, you can do the math for what it makes sense for you, but generally speaking, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing it with less than $100,000 or $150,000. Okay, that's just my personal advice. So you can move that overseas. You can open up your investment opportunities. That's going to make sense if you have more money to your name. And what some people need to do, by the way, is look at, what do you have maybe sitting in an old job you worked at years ago that you could move into an IRA to then facilitate this going offshore. Number two is you can just close the thing out, right? So sometimes when people are going overseas, they're moving overseas or even expatriating in the case of the US, they're giving up their citizenship. They don't want to leave behind assets in the US. Now, there's nothing wrong with leaving behind assets if you're moving overseas, even if you're giving up your citizenship. You can keep things like bank accounts in many cases. You can keep your IRA. People think that when you renounce, something magical happens. But what some people want to do, especially if they're under that low six-figure number, is they just say, you know what, let's just close it out. I didn't want my money in the system. I don't trust the government with it. I don't trust them not to change the rules. Let me just protect myself from all that. It's not a lot of money. I'm going to pay the tax and or the penalty. I'm going to get out of the system. Okay, so option number two is just close it out, take the hit, right? Sometimes it's worth just getting out of the system and paying a price, right? And I think that, my advice of don't be cheap. I'm not saying close your IRA out, but I'm saying, consider that sometimes there's a price to pay for having flexibility, right? If you got a tax deduction on that money before, consider it somewhat of a wash potentially. And, if you have 25 or 50 grand, what I've had people tell me, I'm not saying this is the advice for you, but what I've had people tell me is, you know what, Andrew, it's 50 grand. I'm going to waste 12 grand, get the money in my name. I'm sure I can do a lot better having total control of it, not being in the system, not worrying if they're going to force IRAs to be put into treasuries, or they're going to try and take some of it, or they're going to change the rules for when you can take it, or whatever, means tests. Let me just take the hit and be out, okay? Now, the third thing that you can do if you're leaving the country or even expatriating is just leave the IRA there. Nothing wrong with that. And again, even some people who expatriate, they leave the IRA there. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll structure it to where, hey, it's 500 grand. I don't want to move it overseas. Okay, I don't have any more U.S. income since I've expatriated, for example. I'll take out a certain amount of money every year to lower my taxes, right? So if I take out 500 grand at once, that's going to be worse than a 5-year, plan. And so people will just leave it. Maybe they'll take it out over time. Maybe if they're a little bit older, they'll wait until they're at the appropriate age so they can take it out on better terms. Or just leave it and use it as usual. I mean, some people just feel comfortable having their money in an IRA. They don't think that the U.S. government's going to change the rules. They don't think anything untoward is going to happen. And so they're comfortable just to leave it there. Nothing wrong with that. Now, in some cases, you might want to talk to whomever is holding the money for you and make sure, hey, I'm moving overseas. Hey, I'm making this change in my life. Is that okay for you? Because obviously certain institutions might have their own policies. But nothing wrong with leaving it there, okay? And so what I tell people is, do you trust the system? That's the question I would ask. You can answer that question for yourself. Do you believe taxes are going up? Do you believe that your investments in an IRA are the best ones? Sometimes it's worth paying to get out of a bad marriage, as it were. Sometimes it's worth keeping it. Sometimes it's worth just making some tweaks to it. So those are three options that people generally talk about doing when they're moving overseas, when they're cutting their ties with the U.S. for handling their retirement accounts. How can Nomad Capitalist help you? 4 ways. Number 1, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell to make sure you get our new video every day. Number 2, get a copy of Nomad Capitalist, the book. You'll learn a lot of my personal experiences over a dozen years of studying this stuff, as well as exactly some of the strategies that you can use to build your Nomad Capitalist plan. Number 3, if you're not sure where to start, but you want to come and learn from my team and I, you want to come and mingle with like-minded people, learn more about our live conference, Nomad Capitalist Live. It's coming up soon. And number 4, if you want some help right now because you've got a burning issue, you need something solved, you want to lower your taxes, get a second passport, or build the Nomad Capitalist lifestyle of your dreams, go to nomadcapitalist.com and click on Become a Client.